My name is John Miller. I'm 76 years old and have lived in my house on Elm Street in Columbus, Ohio, for over 40 years. It's a 2-story red brick cottage with a small garden and old oak trees in the yard, a place I inherited from my father. It was once a happy home, filled with me, my late wife Mary, and our little Sarah. Now, my daughter and son-in-law sit at my dining table once a week for a family dinner, and the atmosphere is nothing like it was when Mary was alive. Tonight's Sunday dinner began, as usual, with Sarah complaining about her job. "That damn new manager has lost his mind," she said, waving her fork over a plate of meatballs. "He wants us to increase our output by 20% per shift, 20%. It's as if he thinks the trucks drive themselves and the cargo teleports from point A to point B." My daughter Sarah, at 52, is a logistics manager for a local shipping company called Swift Freight. It's a stressful job that requires her to constantly oversee dozens of drivers and hundreds of deliveries. After her mother passed away 10 years ago, she made it a habit to come over for dinner every Sunday, supposedly to check on her old father. In reality, these visits feel more like a chore she performs without much enthusiasm, driven more by habit than genuine concern. "I understand your frustration, honey," her husband David said, carefully cutting his steak into perfectly even pieces. "It's the same story at Nationwide Assurance. New requirements every week and they're downsizing." David Peterson, 55, is a senior claims adjuster for one of the state's largest insurance firms. He's of average height, with a neatly trimmed beard and observant gray eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses. He and Sarah married 5 years ago. She a widow, he a divorcee. They live in the new Oakwood Heights neighborhood on the edge of the city, in one of those standard 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom houses with a garage, built for the growing middle class. David is polite to me, but always a bit distant, treating me more like an obligatory relative he has to see for his wife's sake. He never objects to these Sunday dinners and participates in the conversation, but I can sense that for him, too, these visits are more of an obligation than a pleasure. "So what did you have to deal with at work today?" Sarah asked her husband, pouring more iced tea from the pitcher. "A suspicious fire over on West Broad Street," David said, setting down his fork and rubbing the bridge of his nose. "The owner of a Digital Planet electronics store is trying to file a claim for merchandise that supposedly burned up 3 weeks ago." "So what? Fraud?" "Absolutely. The paperwork is so crudely forged that even an intern would spot the inconsistencies. The invoices were printed on a standard home printer. The company's stamps are fake. Even the paper isn't the same quality that the major electronics suppliers use." David sounded professional, but I noticed he was a bit distracted today. Several times, he glanced away from the conversation and toward my desk, which stood in the corner of the living room between the bookshelf and the large window. The solid oak desk with its 3 drawers had belonged to my father and has been in this house for over half a century. The surface is scuffed from years of use, but the wood is sturdy and reliable. It's where I read the morning paper, do crossword puzzles, and occasionally write letters to the few old friends I still have. "How much money are we talking about?" Sarah inquired. "Almost $150,000, David replied, "but I calculated the actual market value of the goods. It's $30,000 at most. On top of that, the inventory list includes items the store doesn't even sell." "Like what?" "Professional video cameras, studio recording gear, medical equipment, and the store specializes in consumer electronics, refrigerators, washing machines, TVs." "What's going to happen to the owner now?" Sarah pressed. "A criminal case is guaranteed," David shrugged. "Insurance fraud of that amount is a serious crime. Plus, I found out from colleagues in a neighboring county that he tried a similar scheme 2 years ago in Dayton. There was another mysterious fire, and the damage estimate was inflated by several times." "What a fool," Sarah snorted. "He thought he could pull one over on everyone." "There are a lot of people like that," David agreed. "They think insurance companies just write checks without looking at the details. The truth is, we examine every case under a microscope." I sat at the head of the table, eating in silence and only half listening to their conversation. Over the 76 years of my life, I've learned a simple truth. In family discussions like this, it's best to stay quiet. My opinion doesn't interest anyone here, and any attempt I make to join in is usually met with poorly hidden irritation from Sarah. Turn on the news, David, my daughter said. I want to see what's happening in the world. David reached for the remote and turned on the small television that sat on a stand against the wall between the kitchen and living room. The familiar face of a local evening news anchor appeared on the screen, a young woman with a professional smile, perfect hair, and a smooth, well-practiced voice. Good evening. Here's the news summary for today, Sunday, March 23rd. Our top story tonight: local businessman Michael Davis has been found dead in Columbus. The body of the 43-year-old owner of the Davis Construction Group was discovered this morning by a city worker in the decedent's car, which was parked in an empty lot in the warehouse district near the old tire factory. According to the preliminary coroner's report, the death occurred last night between 6 and 10 p.m. The cause and circumstances of death are under investigation, and further tests have been scheduled. The Columbus Police Department is asking any potential witnesses or anyone with information about Mr. Davis's final days to contact their hotline. Another murder, Sarah grumbled, setting her fork down. This city gets more dangerous every year. I remember when I was a kid, things like this never happened. People could walk the streets at night without being afraid. Davis, David said thoughtfully, chewing his food slowly. I think I've seen that name somewhere. Maybe he was one of our clients, or I saw his name on some paperwork. You know all your clients by sight? Sarah asked, surprised. Not all of them, of course, but some names stick with you, David explained, especially if the case was complicated. In the construction business, there are always disputes over insurance payments, equipment failures, workplace accidents, stolen materials. I continued to finish my meal in silence as I listened to them talk. Michael Davis. The name meant nothing to me, although in a city the size of Columbus you eventually hear about everyone. But in recent years, a lot of new faces, new businesses, and new companies had come to town. Old acquaintances had gradually passed away, moved to other states to be with their children, or simply fallen out of touch. What do you think happened to this Davis guy? Sarah asked her husband, clearly intrigued by the crime story. It's hard to say without more details, David answered cautiously. His profession had taught him to analyze facts rather than speculate. But if he's a construction entrepreneur, it's probably related to his business. Bad deals, debts to suppliers, fierce competition, maybe problems with contractors. Or maybe it was a random robbery, Sarah suggested. He was driving late at night and got attacked. Unlikely, David said, shaking his head. Street robbers don't usually bother with moving a body. They take the valuables and run, leaving the victim at the scene. But the report said the body was placed in a car and driven to an empty lot. That sounds more like an organized, premeditated murder, possibly a message. That's creepy, Sarah shuddered. What if it's a serial killer? It's too early to jump to that conclusion, David countered. Serial criminals usually follow a specific pattern, a recognizable signature. So far, we're only dealing with a single incident. All this talk of crime and murder wasn't helping my appetite, but I methodically continued to eat my dinner. At my age, you get used to death being a frequent and unwelcome guest on the news. Every week the obituaries in the paper mention someone I knew, or at least someone from my generation. Dad, you haven't said a word all night, Sarah finally said, noticing my silence. You could at least ask how we're doing, what's going on in our lives. I lifted my eyes from my plate and looked at my daughter. Sarah looked exhausted after a long work week. Her dark hair was a bit disheveled. There were deep shadows under her eyes, and her face wore a mask of chronic fatigue. Her job as a logistics manager demanded constant mental focus, quick decisions, and the ability to deal with everyone from polite clients to rude truck drivers. How are things at work? I asked dutifully, already knowing the answer. Just great, Sarah said with poorly concealed sarcasm. We work ourselves to the bone from morning till night. We can't afford anything nice, and you just sit here in your house without a care in the world. You read your papers, watch TV, and walk in your garden. Sarah, don't, David interjected gently, sensing the conversation was taking a sour turn. Your father's just tired. Tired from what? She snapped, putting her fork down and turning to face me. From reading newspapers? Watching television? Walking in his own garden? It was a long-standing and painful theme in our relationship. After Mary died, my relationship with my daughter had soured, and it continued to worsen with each passing year. Sarah believed that since I retired, I'd become too withdrawn and indifferent to the family's life. She thought I should be more interested in their problems, helping them with advice or, even better, with money. But the truth was, my few attempts to get involved in their affairs were met with a lack of enthusiasm and often ended with her accusing me of meddling. "We're in serious financial trouble, Dad," Sarah continued, clearly determined to vent all the frustration that had built up over the last few months. The mortgage, the loan on my car, the loan on David's car, utilities go up every month, and so do groceries. David is working his tail off, putting in overtime and taking on extra cases, and we still barely have enough for the essentials. David coughed awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable discussing the details of their family budget in front of me. He was a private man who didn't like to air his personal problems. "Honey, we shouldn't burden your father with our financial issues," he said, giving his wife a warning look. "Why not?" Sarah shot back. "He's my father. He's family. You could at least show some sympathy. Ask if there's anything you can do to help." I finished my lukewarm tea and carefully placed the cup on its saucer. It was pointless to argue with my daughter. She had long ago decided that I was a selfish and indifferent old man who cared only about his own peace and comfort. I had no intention of trying to change her mind. "Thanks for dinner," I said, getting up from the table. "I'm going to read the paper before bed." "Sure, go read your paper," Sarah said, her voice laced with resentment. "The important thing is that nothing bothers you, that no one disturbs your peace." I walked toward the desk in the corner of the living room without responding to her jab. It was my usual spot for evening reading. Next to it sat a comfortable leather armchair that had belonged to my father, and a floor lamp with a green glass shade provided good light. Everything I needed was always within reach. I opened the top drawer of the desk and pulled a ring of keys from my pocket. There were 3 keys on a simple steel ring, one for the front door, one for the padlock on the backyard shed, and a third, smaller key that Sarah and David didn't even know existed. I carefully placed the keys in the drawer next to the pens, pencils, a spare pair of reading glasses, and other small, useful items. "Good night," I said, slowly closing the drawer and making sure it was shut tight. "Good night, Dad," Sarah replied, her tone noticeably less annoyed. "Sleep well," David added. But I noticed that my son-in-law was watching me with a sharp, scrutinizing gaze, focused specifically on the way I had put my keys in the desk drawer. A flicker of something in his gray eyes behind his glasses made me uneasy. It was a look of intense, calculating interest in my simple daily habits. That evening, however, I didn't give it much thought. A mistake I would soon regret. After dinner, we all went about our evening routines. Sarah went to the kitchen to wash the dishes, muttering under her breath about how hard it was to work for a shipping company. David helped her clear the table, loading plates and utensils into the dishwasher. As usual, I sat in my armchair by the desk with the evening paper. "I'm tired as a dog," Sarah sighed, drying her hands on a kitchen towel. "I have to be at work by 7 in the morning. I think we'll just stay the night, Dad. It's too late to drive all the way across town." "Of course you can stay," I nodded. The guest room was always ready. It didn't happen often, but sometimes my daughter and son-in-law would stay over, especially if dinner ran late or the weather was bad. The house had a guest bedroom on the second floor, a small but cozy room with a double bed and an old dresser. "Thank you," David said. "We'll leave early tomorrow so we won't be in your way." Around 10:30, Sarah finished in the kitchen and headed upstairs. "I'm going to take a shower and go to bed," she announced. "David, don't stay up too late on your laptop." "I'll just work for another half hour," my son-in-law replied, pulling a laptop out of his bag. "I need to finish the report on that arson case." David sat down at the kitchen table, opened his computer, and pretended to work. But as I sat in my chair with my back to the kitchen, I could feel his eyes on me. He was watching me. Soon, the muffled sound of a television drifted down from the guest bedroom. Sarah had turned on some late-night movie, just as she always did before falling asleep. I heard the shower run, and then silence. Within half an hour, it was clear she was asleep. Around 11 p.m., I put down the paper, got up from my chair, and stretched. "I'm heading to bed," I said to David. "Don't stay up too late." "Good night," my son-in-law said, his eyes still fixed on the laptop screen. I went up to my bedroom, changed into my pajamas, brushed my teeth, and lay down. I turned on the small TV in my room. An old Humphrey Bogart movie was on, but I watched it distractedly, listening more to the sounds of the house. David was now alone downstairs, and it was exactly what he had been waiting for. Sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open, David Peterson was consumed by a problem that was growing more serious by the day, an $8,000 debt that had turned his life into a nightmare. It had all started 6 months ago, last October. A colleague from work, senior adjuster Mike Thornton, had invited him to a private poker club. "It's a respectable crowd," Mike had urged. "Doctors, lawyers, businessmen. They play a civilized gentleman's game. It's a good way to unwind and make a little extra cash." The club, known as the Cypress Room, was located in the basement of an upscale restaurant downtown. It was nothing flashy, just a few poker tables, dim lighting, leather armchairs, and a small bar in the corner. Solid middle-aged men gathered there on Thursdays after work to play a few hands and talk business. David turned out to be a decent player. His years as an insurance adjuster had taught him how to read people, spot deception, and analyze behavior. Those skills were invaluable at the poker table. He could control his emotions, maintain a poker face, and carefully watch the gestures and expressions of his opponents. For the first 3 months, he was successful. David rarely lost more than $100 in a night, and often won between $200 and $400. By New Year's, he had accumulated a nice sum, almost $3,000 in net profit. Sarah knew nothing about these winnings. David told his wife he was working late on difficult cases or meeting with colleagues. He spent the money on gifts for her, on updating his wardrobe, and on fancy dinners on the weekends. Sarah was pleased with their improved lifestyle and didn't ask too many questions. But in January, his luck began to change. At first, David didn't pay much attention. In gambling, streaks of good and bad luck are normal. He just needed to ride out the losing streak, stay composed, play smart and cautious. However, the losses continued. In January, he lost about $1,000. In February, another $2,500. By early March, all his accumulated winnings were gone, and David started playing on credit. The club's organizers, the Russo brothers, who owned several restaurants and bars in the city, willingly extended credit to their regular customers. The terms seemed reasonable enough. 10% interest per month with payment deferred for up to 2 months. David borrowed a little at a time, $500 here, $1,000 there. He was certain he would win it back soon. After all, he was a good player. He knew the rules. He could count cards and read people. He just needed a little more time, but time was working against him. By mid-March, his debt had ballooned to $8,000. The Russo brothers started to lose their patience. First, it was polite reminders after a game. Then came the phone calls to his home and office. Then, personal visits. "David, we respect you. You're a good guy," the older brother Rick Russo said, cornering him in the parking lot outside the insurance company. "But the money needs to be paid back in a reasonable time. It's just business, nothing personal." "I understand," David replied, glancing nervously at the office windows. "Just give me another week, 2 at the most, and I'll pay it all back." "Good. But our patience is running out. We have a reputation to maintain, you know. If one client doesn't pay, others start to think it's okay not to pay." Last week, the tone of their conversations had changed. Rick Russo called David's house on a Saturday morning while Sarah was in the shower. "Listen, pal, my patience is wearing thin," he said, dropping his usual polite demeanor. "I have people who specialize in collecting debts. I'd rather not get them involved in our business." "Just give me a little more time," David pleaded. "I'll find the money." "By the end of the month. That's your deadline." The end of March was less than a week away. David had exhausted all his options. A bank loan would take too long to process. Asking friends or colleagues for a loan was out of the question. No one would lend him $8,000 without an explanation, and he couldn't tell the truth. His credit cards were already maxed out. Sell his car? But then he'd have to explain to Sarah where the money went. Besides, his used Honda was worth $12,000 at most, and he still had an outstanding loan on it. That's when David's attention turned to his father-in-law. John Miller had sold his previous house about 5 years ago, shortly before David married Sarah. David remembered that house, a 2-story brick cottage in an upscale Columbus neighborhood with a large yard, old oak trees, and a well-kept garden. Real estate in that area wasn't cheap, at least $150,000, probably more. Where had the old man put all that money? Sarah had mentioned that her father lived very modestly. He dressed simply, took the bus, and shopped at discount grocery stores. His only real expenses were books and subscriptions to a few newspapers and magazines. If a person spends, at most, $1,000 a month and received $150,000 or more from the sale of his house, where was the rest of the money? It was logical to assume it was in a bank account or a home safe. David had tried several times to subtly ask Sarah about her father's financial situation. "Has your dad ever thought about moving into a retirement community?" he asked one morning at breakfast. "It must be hard for him to maintain such a big house by himself." "No way," Sarah had scoffed. "He's too attached to that house. He'd never agree to move. Besides, he probably doesn't have enough money for a decent nursing home." "But he sold his old house, right? There must have been a good amount left over." Sarah had shrugged. "I have no idea how much money he has. He never talks about it. All I know is that he lives simply and never complains." Asking John directly was fruitless. The old man always steered the conversation away from money. When asked if he needed financial help, he would reply that he was managing just fine on his own. He never mentioned any savings. But tonight, David had noticed a crucial detail: the way the old man put his keys away in the desk drawer. The movements were practiced, ritualistic. He had obviously been doing it every day for years. David had carefully studied the key ring as John pulled it from his pocket. 3 keys on a simple steel ring. One was large, clearly for the front door. The second, smaller one, was probably for a gate or a shed. And the third key looked unusual. It was small and flat, with a distinctive head. David had seen similar keys in his line of work. They were keys for bank safes and safe deposit boxes. If the old man had a safe deposit box, it could very well contain money or valuables. He just had to find out which bank and the box number. David looked at his watch. It was 12:30. The house was silent upstairs. Sarah had been asleep for over an hour, and the old man hadn't made a sound. The television in his bedroom had turned off, which meant the auto-off timer had activated. Now was the time to act. David closed his laptop and rose quietly from his chair. The floorboards under his feet creaked, but not too loudly. It was normal for an old house. He walked over to the desk and examined it. It was solid oak with 3 drawers. The top one was the smallest, where the keys were. The middle one was larger, and the bottom one was the most spacious. There were no locks on the drawers. David listened to the sounds of the house. Silence. Only the ticking of the wall clock in the kitchen and the faint hum of the refrigerator. He carefully gripped the handle of the top drawer and pulled slowly. The drawer slid open without a sound, as if the mechanism had been recently oiled. Inside, everything was orderly. The keyring lay in plain sight, next to pens, pencils, reading glasses in a case, and a small flashlight. Everything was neatly arranged, each item in its place. David carefully picked up the keyring and held it up to the light of the desk lamp. Yes, the third key was definitely for a bank safe. He took a picture of it with his phone, making sure the flash was off. Tomorrow, he would show the photo to some contacts he had in the banking industry. There were only 4 major banks in Columbus that offered safe deposit box rentals. Figuring out which one the key belonged to wouldn't be difficult. David was about to put the keys back when he noticed something else in the far corner of the drawer. An envelope. A plain white envelope, quite thick, was tucked away in the back, half hidden behind a box of spare batteries. There was no writing on it, but it was carefully taped shut and obviously contained something important. David carefully pulled out the envelope and turned it over in his hands. The paper was old and yellowed with time, and the adhesive on the tape had lost its freshness. The envelope had been sitting there for years, Curiosity battled with caution, but curiosity won. He picked at the edge of the tape with his fingernail and began to open the envelope, trying not to tear the paper. The old adhesive gave way easily. Inside were documents and photographs. David took them out and held them up to the light of the desk lamp, shielding them with his hand to avoid creating too bright a spot. The first was a black and white photograph, about 4 by 6 inches. The quality was decent, despite its age. Judging by the style, it had been taken in the 1950s or early 60s. The photo showed a man in his 30s wearing a dark suit getting out of a car. The face was clear, and David easily recognized him as a young John Miller. The same facial features, the same eyes, though his hair was dark and thick. But that wasn't what stunned David. It was what was happening in the background. By another car, about 20 feet away from John, 2 men in dark clothes were pulling something large and wrapped in a tarp from the open trunk. The size and shape of the bundle left no doubt that it was a human body. The scene had clearly been filmed with a hidden camera. The angle was poor, shot from a distance, perhaps from a building window or another car, but the faces of everyone involved were clear enough. David turned the photograph over. On the back, written in pencil, were the words, August 23rd, 52, warehouses on Industrial Ave. His hands began to tremble. David set the first picture aside and picked up the next. The second photo showed the same young John Miller, but in a different setting. He was standing next to an expensive car, judging by its design, a Cadillac from the early 50s, talking to a man in a fine coat and hat. The conversation was clearly business-related. John was handing an envelope to the man, who in turn was giving him a small briefcase. On the back, it read, September 10th, 52, payment for services, $15,000. $15,000 in 1952 was a fortune, equivalent to over $150,000 today. The third photograph was even more shocking. John was driving a dark car with another man in the passenger seat. On the back seat lay a long object, neatly wrapped in cloth. From its size and shape, it was clearly a rifle or a shotgun. October 18th, 52, preparing for operation at the Levesque Tower Hotel. David frantically sorted through the rest of the photos. There were about a dozen of them, all black and white, all dated between 1951 and 1954. Each one showed a young John Miller in various situations that left no doubt about the nature of his work. Meetings with suspicious individuals in deserted locations, exchanges of money and weapons, surveillance of targets. In one photo, he was even captured entering a house with a small bag in his hand. On the back, it was captioned, Witness Elimination, James Collins. But the pictures were only the beginning. David put them aside and picked up the documents. The first was a clipping from the Columbus Dispatch, dated September 15th, 1952. The headline read, Missing Businessman Found in River. The article stated, The body of Robert McDaniel, 36-year-old owner of a grocery store chain, was discovered yesterday by fishermen in the Scioto River, 20 miles from the city. According to the coroner, Mr. McDaniel had been in the water for at least a week. The cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head. Police are investigating it as a homicide. Mr. McDaniel disappeared on August 27th after not returning home from work. David compared the date on the newspaper with the date on the first photograph. August 23rd, the scene at the warehouses. August 27th, McDaniel's disappearance. September 15th, the discovery of the body. The next clipping was dated October 25th, 1952. Hotel murder remains unsolved. The Columbus police are still investigating the murder of Charles Hendricks, which occurred at the Levesque Tower Hotel on October 18th. Mr. Hendricks, a prominent attorney and community leader, was found dead in his hotel room from a gunshot wound to the heart. No witnesses to the crime have been found. Detectives are asking anyone with information about Mr. Hendricks's final days to contact the police. October 18th was the date written on the back of the photo of John preparing for the operation at the hotel. David went through the newspaper clippings one by one, and the picture became horrifyingly clear. Dozens of murders over several years. Businessmen, lawyers, witnesses in important cases, petty criminals. The victims were varied, but they all had one thing in common. They had been killed professionally, without a trace, and not a single one of the crimes had ever been solved. And in this envelope was photographic proof of who was behind it all. The last document was a fake ID, an Ohio driver's license in the name of James Robert Baker, issued in 1951. The photo showed a young John Miller, but with a different haircut and glasses. The forgery was excellent. Even under close inspection, it was hard to spot any flaws. On the back of the card, written in small handwriting, was a note. Working name for operations in Cleveland and suburbs. Use only when absolutely necessary. David had been studying the documents for about half an hour when he heard a faint creak of floorboards from upstairs. He froze, listening. Was it Sarah getting up to use the bathroom? Or maybe it was just the house settling. Old wooden structures often creaked at night due to temperature changes. But the creaking repeated. And this time, David knew someone was walking down the hallway on the second floor, slowly, carefully, trying not to make a sound. His heart hammered against his ribs. David quickly began stuffing the photos and documents back into the envelope. He should have put everything back and pretended nothing had happened. But it was too late. I came down the stairs and stopped in the doorway, watching my son-in-law. David sat at my desk, surrounded by documents from an envelope he had no right to touch. Pictures from my youth were scattered on the desktop, and his face was a mask of horror. Interesting. In all my years, no one had ever shown such an unhealthy curiosity about my personal belongings. Sarah had never gone through my drawers, and previous guests had been content with what was offered to them. "Can't sleep?" I asked quietly, stepping into the living room. David jumped as if he'd been electrocuted and began frantically scooping up the pictures from the floor where they had fallen. Yeah, I was just looking for a pen," he mumbled. "I wanted to write down a phone number." "A phone number? At 1 a.m? I asked, moving closer. My son-in-law licked his lips nervously. "A client called, left a message. I just remembered and decided to write it down before I forgot." I glanced at one of the photos lying face up on the desk. It was from '53, a picture of me handing an envelope of cash to a man named Garcia. Those were good times. Simple orders, honest pay, no questions asked. "That's an interesting picture," I said. "What do you make of it?" "I don't think anything," David answered quickly, shoving the last of the photos into the envelope. "It's none of my business. I was just looking for a pen and accidentally opened a sealed envelope." I picked up a photo from the floor that he'd missed. "And accidentally studied its contents for half an hour?" David realized he was caught. Panic filled his eyes. "Look, I'll put it all back and I'll forget I ever saw it," he began hastily. "I don't want any trouble. I won't say a word to anyone." "It's too late for that," I said calmly. "You've already seen it." I took the envelope from his trembling hands and casually flipped through the contents. All the documents were there. The photographs, the newspaper clippings, the fake ID. Good thing I didn't keep the really important items here. "Sit down." I nodded toward the chair next to the desk. "We need to talk." "I should probably go to bed," David tried to object. "I have to get up early tomorrow." "Sit down," I repeated, my voice taking on a tone that left no room for argument. David sank into the chair. I sat across from him, placing the envelope carefully on the table between us. "Tell me about your debts," I said. "What debts?" He tried to feign surprise, but it was unconvincing. "David," I said calmly, "let's not waste time. People don't rifle through other people's drawers in the middle of the night for no reason. You're looking for money, which means you owe someone. How much? And to whom?" My son-in-law sat in silence, wrestling with himself. I could see the thoughts racing through his mind. Deny, lie, make excuses. 8,000, I suggested. Gambling debts. He flinched, and I knew I'd hit the mark. "How did you know?" he blurted out. "I've been studying people for many years," I replied. "It was an important part of my job. You've been nervous for the past few weeks, avoiding phone calls when we're around, constantly checking your messages. Classic signs of someone who owes a lot of money." David lowered his head. "Okay, yes, I owe 8,000 to the guys at the poker club, but I won't tell anyone about these pictures, I swear. I'll forget all about it." "Who exactly?" I asked, ignoring his pleas. The Russo brothers. They run the club. Are they serious people? Yes, very serious. What happens if you don't pay on time? David swallowed hard. Nothing good. They've already started making threats. I nodded. The situation was clear and all too common. A man with weak willpower had gotten in over his head trying to make easy money, and now he was paying the price for his foolishness. How much time do you have? Until the end of the month, less than a week. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark garden. The old oaks swayed in the wind, their silhouettes reminding me of a time when I was young and full of energy. Back then, problems like this were solved quickly and efficiently. I have a proposition for you, I said, turning back to David. You forget everything you saw tonight. In return, I will take care of your debt problem. He stared at me in disbelief. Really? Yes, but there are conditions. Anything you want, he agreed quickly. First, you will never ever breathe a word of this to anyone. Not to Sarah, not to your friends, not to the police. One hint, one careless phrase, and our deal is off. Immediately. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. The second condition is that you stop gambling, forever. No cards, no betting, no casinos. If I find out you've broken this rule, the consequences will be very unpleasant. Understood, David nodded. Third, we will never speak of this conversation again. As far as anyone else is concerned, nothing happened tonight. You got up for a drink of water, and I came downstairs because I couldn't sleep. We chatted about the weather and went back to our rooms. That works, I held out my hand. Shake on it. David shook my hand. His grip was weak and sweaty, not like the real men I used to deal with. The money will be delivered to you tomorrow afternoon, I said. $8,000. Where it comes from is none of your business. Thank you, he whispered. I don't know how to thank you. Silence, I said curtly. That's the only thanks I need. I took the envelope and placed it carefully back in the drawer. Then I closed it and turned to my son-in-law, who was still sitting in the chair with a dazed expression. And remember one more thing, David, I said quietly. What you saw in those pictures happened a long time ago. It was a different life, a different time, a different person. But some skills, once you learn them, never go away. They stay with you for the rest of your life. I started toward the stairs, but stopped at the bottom and turned back to David, who was still frozen in his chair, trying to process everything. One more thing, I said. Tomorrow morning, you will act completely natural. Sarah must not suspect a thing. Women can sense dishonesty better than men. Understood, he nodded. And don't start treating me any differently. No fawning, no fear in your eyes. I'm still the same boring old man I was before tonight. All right then. Good night, son-in-law, I said with a hint of irony, and went upstairs. Leaving David alone in the dimly lit living room, I went up to my bedroom. I heard him sit downstairs for another 10 minutes, absorbing the shock of what he had learned. Finally, he got up and quietly made his way to the guest room. I got into bed but couldn't sleep. My mind drifted back to a time I hadn't thought about in years. The 50s, the early 60s, it was a different era with different rules. In many ways, life was simpler then. An order, a job, a payment, no unnecessary questions, no remorse. But those days were long gone. I left that world behind in '64 when I realized I was becoming too visible to the authorities. The FBI was starting to crack down on organized crime. Investigative methods were improving. The risks were getting higher. It was time to get out. In 13 years of work, I had saved enough money to ensure a comfortable retirement. I bought a house, married Mary, who knew nothing of my past, and got a job as an electrician at a local factory. I lived the quiet, steady life of a law-abiding citizen. And now, more than half a century later, the past had resurfaced, thanks to the curiosity of my hapless son-in-law. In the morning, I woke up at my usual time, 7:30. I made coffee, fried some eggs, and watched the morning news. Sarah and David came downstairs around 8. I went out into the garden to give them some space to have breakfast. Through the window, I watched my son-in-law trying to act natural. He was doing a decent job of it. At least, Sarah didn't seem to suspect anything. David drank his coffee, read the paper, and answered his wife's questions about his plans for the week. A typical family scene. "Good morning," I said, coming back into the house after an hour of work in the garden. "Good morning," David replied, meeting my gaze for a fraction of a second before quickly looking away. "How did you sleep?" I asked, sitting down at the table and pouring myself a cup of coffee. "Fine. And you?" "Not so well. Woke up in the middle of the night, couldn't get back to sleep. Came downstairs for some water. I remember you were up too." "Yeah, I needed to write down a client's phone number," David said. "I remembered it in the middle of the night and decided to jot it down so I wouldn't forget." "I see. The memory isn't what it used to be at our age." Sarah listened to our exchange while flipping through a magazine. To her, it was just an ordinary conversation about everyday things. Nothing suspicious. "By the way," I added, turning to David, "if you ever need a pen, you can always find one in the desk drawer. There are a couple in there." "Thanks, I'll keep that in mind," he replied, and I saw him tense up slightly at the mention of the drawer. At 9 o'clock, they were ready to leave. Sarah kissed my cheek, and David shook my hand. "See you next Sunday," my daughter said. "Goodbye," I replied. "Drive safe." "Have a good week," David added. After they left, I cleaned up the dishes, took a shower, and changed into a casual suit. I had a trip to the bank to make. Huntington Bank was located downtown in a solid red brick building. I'd been a customer there for over 40 years and had earned a certain level of respect from the staff. Mr. Miller, the punctual retiree who always paid his taxes and never caused any trouble. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," said the branch manager, Susan Clark, a woman in her 30s who had handled my account for the past 5 years. "What can I do for you today?" "Good morning, Susan. I need to make a cash withdrawal of $8,000. "Of course. Making a big purchase?" "I'm helping my son-in-law with an unexpected expense," I replied. "A family matter." "I see. Give me just a moment to check your account balance." Susan typed on her keyboard and looked at the monitor. "Everything's in order. Would you like large bills?" "Yes, in hundreds if possible." "No problem. You'll just need to fill out a declaration form. It's a mandatory procedure for withdrawals over $5,000. I filled out the paperwork, listing the purpose of the withdrawal as family expenses. 10 minutes later, I had $8,100 bills in my pocket. On the way home, I stopped at the post office. I had a rented P.O. box there that not even Sarah knew about. The box contained a few documents and a small amount of emergency cash. I took a plain envelope from the box and put the money for David inside. Then, on a separate sheet of paper, I wrote down David's office address and instructions for a courier service. At 2 p.m., I called a courier to deliver the envelope to the insurance company where my son-in-law worked. Anonymous delivery with no trace leading back to me. "Hand it directly to Mr. Peterson," I told the courier, "and no one else." "You got it, sir." David would have the money by 3 p.m. That would give him enough time to go to his bank, withdraw his own savings, add it to the $8,000 and pay off his creditors that evening. I spent the rest of the afternoon in the garden, reading a book in the shade of an old oak tree. Around 4 o'clock, David called. "Hello?" I answered. It's David. I received a package." "What package?" I asked innocently. "Oh, you know, some paperwork for work. Urgent documents." I see. I hope everything's in order?" "Yes, everything's great. Thank you so much for your help with that work matter." "You're welcome. We're family." "Right. Goodbye. Talk to you later." David got the money and understood he needed to keep his mouth shut. Now I could finally relax. In the evening, I made myself a light dinner, watched some television, and got ready for bed around 10 o'clock. But first, I decided to catch the late news. "And now for a recap of today's events," said the anchorwoman. Local businessman Paul Williams was found dead in Columbus. The body of the 60-year-old owner of Williams Automotive was discovered this morning in his office by an employee. According to preliminary reports, the death occurred late last night. I raised my eyebrows. Interesting. The second murder of a businessman in a week. "The cause of death is under investigation," the anchorwoman continued. "Police have not ruled out robbery. This is the second mysterious death of a businessman in Columbus in recent days. Last Sunday, Robert Hutchins, owner of a construction company, was found dead. 2 murders in 1 week, highly unusual for a quiet city like Columbus. I wondered if there was a connection between the victims or if it was just a coincidence. Not my business, though. I hadn't been professionally interested in crime news for a long time. I turned off the TV and went up to my bedroom. Tomorrow would be a typical Monday for an ordinary retiree, watering the flowers, reading the newspaper, a walk in the park. The next morning, I woke up at my usual time and immediately turned on the radio to hear the news. The murder of Williams was the top story. Columbus police are continuing their investigation into the murder of car dealership owner Paul Williams. Investigators say the perpetrator entered the office through a back door and an altercation with the owner ensued. The motive for the crime is unclear. The safe in the office was not opened and no valuables were stolen. Police are asking any witnesses to contact their hotline. That was odd. If the safe wasn't opened and nothing was stolen, what was the motive? Maybe the killer was someone he knew and it was personal. Well, not my problem. I had more important things to do, like monitoring David's behavior. Around noon, I got a call from Sarah. "Hi, Dad. How are you?" "Fine, and you?" "Good. Listen, David was acting strange last night. He came home in a good mood, said he'd solved a problem at work, but then he tossed and turned all night. Couldn't sleep. Maybe he's stressed about something. I don't know. He's been on edge lately. Maybe it's work, maybe it's something else." "Working for an insurance company is stressful," I said. "You have to deal with unpleasant situations all the time." "I guess. By the way, did you see the news? Another murder in the city." "Yes, I heard. It's a sad story." "It worries me, Dad. 2 murders in a week isn't normal for our city." "Columbus is growing, Sarah. More people, more problems. It's only natural." "Maybe, but it's still scary. Good thing you live in a quiet neighborhood." "I'm careful. I always lock my doors at night." "That's good. Take care of yourself." "You too." After talking to my daughter, I went for a walk. I strolled down the familiar streets, thinking about how quickly the world was changing. It used to be that people knew their neighbors, and crime was rare. Now, the city had become a typical American metropolis with all the problems that came with it. That evening, I watched the news again. The investigation into the Williams murder had hit a dead end. No witnesses, no evidence. The police were floating various theories, but none of them held much water. Before bed, the phone rang. It was David. "Good evening," said the familiar voice, though it sounded strained. "Evening. How are you?" "I'm fine. Did you see the news, by the way?" "Yes, that terrible story about the car dealer." "Very terrible," David agreed, and I detected something strange in his voice. "Crime is on the rise in the city." "Unfortunately, yes, we all have to be more careful." "Yeah, careful." A short pause. "Anything else?" I asked. "No, nothing. Just wanted to say good night." "Good night, David." I hung up the phone and thought. There was a strange note in my son-in-law's voice. Suspicion, fear, or just the paranoia of a man who had learned too much. More than likely, David was starting to connect my past with the recent murders in town. Logical, but incorrect. I'd retired a long time ago and had no intention of returning to my old profession. Well, let him think what he wants, as long as he keeps his mouth shut. And fear is a powerful motivator for silence. I went to bed, satisfied with my day. David's problem was solved, the money was delivered, and family peace was restored. True, my son-in-law now knew my secret, but in a way, that was a good thing. Now he would treat me with the respect I deserved, and the coincidence of the Williams murder. Well, sometimes life serves up interesting surprises. I had nothing to do with it, but if David thought otherwise, so be it. Knowledge is power, and the fear that comes with that knowledge is an even greater power. For the next few weeks, I watched David with a certain amusement. Our late-night conversation had made exactly the impression I had hoped for. My son-in-law lived in a constant state of tension, burdened by my secret but powerless to do anything about it. Every Sunday dinner became an ordeal for him. He sat at my table, ate my food, and participated in family conversations, but I saw him flinch every time our eyes met. Excellent. Fear is a great motivator for upholding an agreement. "David, you seem strange tonight," Sarah said after another Sunday dinner as they were driving home. "You haven't said a word the whole way, and you're barely answering my questions." "Just tired," my son-in-law replied, avoiding looking in my direction. "A lot of work this week." I walked them to their car, as I always did. "Take care," I said, closing the car door behind Sarah. "Goodbye, Dad," my daughter replied. "See you," David muttered, starting the engine quickly. As I watched their car disappear around the corner, I felt a sense of satisfaction. The situation was under my complete control. But a few days later, Sarah called me with questions. "Dad, is everything okay between you and David?" she asked bluntly. "Of course. Why?" "He's been acting so strange lately. He's quiet at home and he seems to be having problems at work. And he's been treating you differently." "Differently how?" I asked, though I knew exactly what she meant. "He avoids eye contact with you, agrees with every word you say, and looks tense whenever you're around. It's like he's afraid of you." "Maybe he's worried about his job. The insurance business isn't easy right now." "Maybe," Sarah agreed uncertainly, "but I don't think it's just his job." I listened to my daughter and realized that David wasn't doing a very good job of playing the part of a man who knew nothing. A woman's intuition is a dangerous thing. Sarah sensed that something had changed, even if she couldn't put her finger on it. "If you want, I can talk to him," I suggested. "Maybe he'll tell me what's bothering him." "I've tried. He just brushes it off and says everything is fine." "Then give him some time. Men sometimes need to work through their problems on their own." After that conversation, I knew I had to take action. David's behavior was creating problems, and it could lead to unwanted questions. That evening, I called him at home. "Hello?" a familiar voice answered. "Good evening, David. It's John." "Good evening," he said, his voice tense. "How are things at work?" "Fine, good. By the way, Sarah called today. She's worried about you, says you've been acting nervous lately." A pause. "It's just a lot of work," David said. "I understand. But you know, women are very sensitive to mood swings. Sarah is starting to ask questions." "What kind of questions?" "About why you've changed, why you're avoiding me, why you look scared in my presence." Another pause. "I'm trying to act normal," he objected weakly. "You're not trying hard enough. Remember our agreement. No one can suspect anything, and Sarah is already suspicious." "What am I supposed to do?" "Relax. I'm not a monster, David. I'm just a retired man helping his son-in-law. If Sarah presses you for an explanation, tell her a plausible story. Work problems, stress, fatigue, anything but the truth." "Got it. I'll see you on Sunday." After that conversation, David's behavior improved slightly, but not by much. He was still reserved in my presence, though he tried to hide it. At the next family dinner, I decided to test how well he had learned his lesson. "David," I said over dessert, "how did things turn out with that arson case you told me about?" He flinched as if I'd hit him with a cattle prod. "What arson?" he asked quickly. "The electronics store. The owner who was trying to get insurance for non-existent merchandise." "Oh, right," he breathed, relieved. "The case is closed. The fraudster was arrested." "Justice has been served," I said with a slight smile. "Yes," David nodded, and I saw him swallow hard. Sarah watched our exchange with a bewildered expression. "You're both acting strange today," she said. "You sound like actors who've forgotten their lines." "Just tired," I replied. "It's normal at our age." "Dad, you're 76, not 90, and David is hardly an old man." "Still," I said calmly, "sometimes fatigue just takes its toll." Cordelia didn't look convinced, but she dropped the subject. After they left, I sat in my armchair for a long time, thinking about the situation. David wasn't playing his part well. Sooner or later, Sarah was going to get to the truth, or at least part of it. Something had to be done. The following week, I called David again. I think we should meet, I said. Talk in person. About what? I could hear the fear in his voice. About how to move forward. Your behavior is causing problems. I'm trying. Not hard enough. Meet me tomorrow evening at the park on Main Street. By the fountain at 7 o'clock. Okay. The next evening, I arrived at the park early. It was a good location, crowded enough for our conversation to seem casual, but with enough background noise that no one could overhear us. David showed up exactly at 7. He looked terrible, pale and gaunt with dark circles under his eyes. Sit down. I nodded to the bench next to the fountain. He sat, leaving a respectable distance between us. You don't look well, I remarked. I haven't been sleeping well since that night, he admitted. I understand, but it will pass, in time. I don't know. Every time I look at you, I think of those pictures. And when you think of those pictures, do you also think of the recent murders in town? David turned to me. Did you have something to do with them? With what exactly? Williams, the car dealer. I gave him a long, steady look. David, I haven't done that kind of work in decades. I'm retired. I grow roses and read newspapers. But the coincidence. Coincidences happen, especially in a big city. And the money? Where did you get $8,000 so quickly? From my bank account. I had some savings from the sale of my old house. David was silent for a moment, processing my words. Are you telling the truth? Why would I lie? I answered. If I were still in my old line of work, do you think I would keep incriminating photographs in my desk drawer? He hesitated. Probably not. Of course not. Those photos are museum pieces, a reminder of a time when I was a different person. Then why do you keep them? Insurance, I said simply. In case anyone ever gets the idea to look into my past, those pictures prove that I know where all the skeletons are buried. Whose skeletons? The people who used to give me my assignments, politicians, businessmen, police officials. Many of them are still alive and in positions of power. David nodded in understanding. Mutually assured destruction. Exactly. They don't touch me, and I don't touch them. We sat in silence for a few minutes, watching people stroll through the park. What should I do now? David finally asked. Live a normal life, go to work, take care of my daughter, plan for the future, and forget what you learned. And if Sarah insists on an explanation, tell her the truth, part of it. What truth? That you were having financial problems and were too afraid to tell her. That I helped you out with the money and now you feel guilty about being in debt to your father-in-law. David thought about it. That could work. It will. Women understand things like family debt and male pride. What if she asks where I got the money? You tell her you don't know. I'm an old man. I have savings. The details are none of her business. We stood up from the bench. And remember, I added, this is the last conversation we will have on this subject. No more meetings, no more phone calls, no more hints. We go back to a normal family life. Got it. All right then. Goodbye, David. Goodbye. As I walked home, I thought about how things had finally stabilized. David now had an explanation that would let him sleep at night. Sarah would have a plausible version of events, and I could return to my quiet, retired life. The following Sunday, the atmosphere at dinner was markedly improved. David seemed calmer. Sarah had stopped asking suspicious questions. We discussed the weather, the news, and plans for the summer. By the way, Dad, Sarah said over tea, David told me about his problems. Thank you for helping him. You're welcome, I replied. We're family. Still, it means a lot, especially to David. He was worried sick. I glanced at my son-in-law. He nodded, confirming his wife's words. Male pride, he explained. I didn't want to admit my financial difficulties. I understand, Sarah said, but there shouldn't be any secrets in a family. There won't be any more, David promised, and indeed, there were no more secrets, at least none that could disturb the family's peace. David learned to live with the knowledge of my past. He realized that the past was in the past, and that I posed no threat to him or his wife. Fear was gradually replaced by respect, and respect by a kind of understanding. Sarah no longer suspected anything was amiss. The explanation about financial troubles and male pride had satisfied her completely. She even began to treat me more warmly, appreciating my willingness to help the family in a time of need. And I returned to my normal life. The garden, books, newspapers, evening walks. The quiet existence of a man who had long ago settled his accounts with the past and had no intention of revisiting it. Sometimes, though, sitting in my armchair in the evening, I would take the old envelope from the drawer and flip through the photos. Not out of nostalgia, but simply to remind myself of who I once was and how far I had come. The young man in the black and white photos seemed like a stranger to me now, from a different era, with different rules, a different life. But the skills I acquired in that life had never gone away. They were just dormant, waiting for a moment when they might be needed again. So far, that moment hadn't come, and I hoped it never would. But if something were to go wrong, if someone were to try to disturb my peace or threaten my family, well, 76 is just a number. Some things you never forget. For now, I remain what I have become, a quiet retiree who grows roses and reads the newspaper, a grandfather who helps his family and doesn't ask too many questions, an ordinary old man with an extraordinary past, and David understands that perfectly.